The morning after my son laid a hand on me, I woke up before the house did. Not because I couldn't sleep, though I hadn't, but because something inside me had already stood up. The clock on the stove said 5:42 a.m. The house was quiet in that way only old houses get quiet, when every sound feels like it might tell on you. I moved slowly, careful with my back, careful with my pride. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I didn't need it. I knew this kitchen better than I knew my own face. I started breakfast. Not the kind you rush through, not the kind you make to keep the peace. The kind you make when you've already made a decision. Coffee first, strong. The smell filled the room and climbed the stairs like it always had. Biscuits next. I rolled the dough by hand, the same way I'd done for decades, the same way my wife used to tease me about. Said I treated flour like it could feel my mood. Maybe it could. That morning, it didn't stick. Everything came together easy, like the kitchen itself knew what this was for. If you'd walked in then, you would have thought it was just another quiet morning in an old man's house. Lace tablecloth, good plates, nothing broken where you could see it. You wouldn't have known that less than 8 hours earlier, I'd been on this same floor, trying to remember how to breathe. I set the table like it was a holiday. Not because I was celebrating, because some things deserve respect, even when they're ending. Upstairs, I heard him move, the familiar thud of his steps, heavy, confident. The sound of a man who believes the world has already decided in his favor. I didn't look up. I poured the coffee, let it steam. He came down expecting silence, the kind that means surrender. That's the thing about silence. People mistake it for weakness, especially the ones who need to believe they're in control. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the table. I felt it before I saw it, the pause, the recalculation. He smiled the way he does when he thinks he's won, the crooked little grin that says, "You'll forgive me. You always do." He pulled out a chair and sat like nothing had happened, like I was just an old man who knew his place. He reached for a biscuit and took a bite, already chewing before he spoke. "Good," he said. "See? I knew you'd come around." I didn't answer. I sat at the head of the table, hands folded, back straight, watching him the way you watch weather roll in, calm but alert. He talked about changes, about what was going to happen next, about how things were going to be clear from now on. Then the chair beside me moved, just a little, wood against wood. That's when his hand froze midair. That's when the color left his face. The biscuit slipped from his fingers and hit the plate with a soft, stupid sound that didn't match the look in his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. But that passed, because this wasn't anger. It wasn't shouting, and it wasn't a revenge story the way people like to imagine them. This was something quieter, something heavier. This was the morning my son realized my silence the night before hadn't been fear. It had been a verdict. Before I tell you what he said next, you need to know who I am. Not the version he talks about, the real one. I'm 72 years old. I've lived in this house longer than I've lived anywhere else. Bought it back when my hands were steady and my back didn't complain every morning. It's not fancy. One story, narrow hallway, floors that creak in places I never bothered to fix because I liked knowing where I was at night. I worked as an electrician for most of my life. Union work. Long hours, cold winters, hot summers. The kind of job where you come home smelling like metal and dust, and you eat standing up because sitting down means you might not get back up again. I didn't hate the work. I hated missing dinners. I hated missing birthdays. But I kept going because someone had to. My wife used to say I measured time in paychecks instead of years. Maybe she was right. I remember counting hours more than holidays, remembering which overtime shift paid extra, remembering which jobs meant groceries and which meant shoes. And every single time, I told myself the same thing. This is for my son. I taught him how to hold a flashlight before he could spell his own name, how to tighten a bolt without stripping it, how to stand still when a grown man was talking to him, not because he was afraid, but because listening mattered. I didn't raise my voice much, didn't have to. When I spoke, I meant it. I wasn't the kind of father who said, "I love you," every day. But I showed up. I paid. I stayed. And if you're listening to this and you grew up with a father like that, or maybe you were that father, you already understand what that means. You don't need it explained. After my wife passed, the house got quieter. Too quiet. He moved back in for a while. That was years ago. I didn't question it. I was glad not to eat dinner alone. Glad to hear another pair of footsteps in the hall, even if they were heavier than they used to be. That's how it starts, isn't it? Not with fear, with relief. I let him take the bigger room. Let him park in the driveway. Let him handle the mail. When money got tight for him, I helped. $1,200 a month, 18 months straight. I didn't keep track. Fathers aren't supposed to keep score. That's the part people don't tell you. When you love someone that way, you don't protect yourself. You assume the bond is enough. I never once thought he'd use that against me. So when he handed me that envelope the night before, placed it right there on the table, careful not to wrinkle it, I didn't open it right away. I just looked at it. White, clean, like it didn't weigh anything at all. Funny thing is, some things don't feel heavy until you finally pick them up. That morning, sitting at the head of the table, watching him chew like nothing in the world had changed, I realized something else too. All those years I thought I was building a life for my son. He'd been quietly deciding what parts of it he wanted to erase. And if you're thinking right now, I would have seen the signs. I used to think that too. He didn't throw it at me. That's what I remember most. If he had slammed it down or waved it in my face, I might have understood it as anger, a tantrum, something loud and temporary. But he didn't do that. He waited until the house had settled for the night, until the television was off and the kitchen light was the only one still on. Then he placed the envelope on the table, right in front of my chair. Neat, careful, like paperwork. I was rinsing a mug in the sink when I noticed it. Plain white, no stamp, no return address. Just my name written across the front in his handwriting. Clean letters, steady. The same handwriting he'd had since high school. The one I'd once been proud of because it looked responsible. "What's this?" I asked. He didn't look up from his phone. "Just something you should read." Not need to read. Should. I dried my hands on a dish towel and sat down. The envelope felt lighter than it should have, almost empty. For a second, I wondered if it was some kind of joke. A bad one. He'd been drinking more lately, talking sharp, acting like the world owed him something it hadn't delivered. I didn't open it right away. I turned it over once, then twice. Old habit. Years of opening bills, union notices, letters that usually meant trouble. You learn to take a breath before you break the seal. "Go ahead," he said, still not looking at me. "It's all there." I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Just one. No letterhead, no greeting, no explanation. At the top, written in pen, were 8 words. Dad. I'm not your son. That was it. No signature, no date. I read it again, slower this time, like maybe the words would rearrange themselves if I gave them a chance. They didn't. They stayed exactly where they were, cold and final. I looked up at him then, really looked, waiting for something in his face to tell me this was a mistake, a test, some cruel way of starting a conversation he didn't know how to have. But his expression was calm, almost relieved. "You serious?" I asked. He shrugged. "It explains a lot, doesn't it?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My mouth felt dry, like I'd been chewing dust. My mind went somewhere strange, not to biology, not to my wife, not even to anger. It went straight to time. Years. Decades. Every morning I'd gotten up before sunrise. Every bill I'd paid on time. Every choice I'd made, thinking I was building something that would outlast me. I lowered my eyes back to the paper. That's when I noticed there was something else tucked behind it. Another page. A copy. Not original. Printed. Legal language. Headings. Phrases like consultation and family status and next steps. Nothing signed, nothing official yet, but official enough to send a message. He leaned back in his chair. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," he said. His voice was steady, practiced. "I'm saying it so things can finally be clear." Clear. That word landed heavier than the letter ever could have. "So whatever you think I owe you," he went on, finally meeting my eyes, "I don't." There it was. The rest of the sentence he hadn't bothered to write down. I folded the paper once, then again. The creases were sharp, deliberate. My hands didn't shake. I noticed that, and it surprised me. I didn't ask him who he thought his real father was. I didn't ask how long he'd been thinking this. I didn't ask a single question, because in that moment, I understood something he didn't realize he'd said out loud. This wasn't about blood. It was about erasing everything that came with it. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slow circles above me. The envelope folded on the nightstand like a quiet accusation. Every time I closed my eyes, those 8 words floated back up, neat and cruel in their simplicity. "Dad, I'm not your son." By morning, the house felt different. Not louder, not hostile, just emptied out. Like something essential had been removed while I wasn't looking. I made coffee the way I always did. 2 scoops, not 3, because that's what my doctor told me after 55. The routine steadied me. I needed that. I sat at the kitchen table, unfolded the paper again, and this time I forced myself to read it the way he wanted me to read it. Not as a father, but as a man being served notice. The words weren't emotional. That was the point. They were clean, efficient, written to erase history, not explain it. There was no accusation in them, no anger, just distance. And suddenly, I understood the real insult. If he'd screamed at me, I could have handled it. If he'd blamed me for something specific, I could have argued back. But this was worse. This was him stepping outside the entire story and pretending none of it counted. Every scraped knee, every late shift, every Christmas bonus that went to his tuition instead of a vacation. All of it quietly filed away as irrelevant. I remembered the first car I ever helped him buy, a used sedan. Cost more than it should have, but I told myself it was worth it if it meant he'd get to work safely. I co-signed the loan, took the hit on my credit, never mentioned it again. That's what fathers do. I remembered standing in the rain at his high school graduation, clapping until my hands hurt, while he scanned the crowd for someone else. I didn't take it personally. Kids grow. They look forward, not back. I remembered defending him when people said he was entitled. He's just figuring things out, I'd say, over and over, like a prayer. Now, sitting there with cold coffee and a letter that pretended none of that existed, it finally clicked. This wasn't a question of paternity. It was a declaration of independence, built on denial. He wasn't rejecting my blood. He was rejecting my sacrifice. That realization settled into my chest slowly, heavy and final. It hurt, yes, but it also clarified things in a way pain sometimes does. I'd spent years believing love meant endurance, that if I just stayed steady long enough, it would be recognized. But recognition wasn't coming. I folded the letter again and placed it back inside the envelope. Then I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I opened the drawer where I kept old paperwork. Mortgage statements, insurance forms, receipts I never bothered to throw away. Proof. Not for a courtroom, not yet. For myself. As I sorted through the stack, I realized something else, something quieter, but just as important. The envelope wasn't the beginning of his story. It was the end of mine. The end of the version of me that accepted being erased politely. I didn't feel rage. I didn't feel revenge. What I felt was resolve. The kind that comes when grief finishes arguing and finally sits down. He thought the letter freed him from owing me anything. What it really did was free me from pretending I didn't see what was happening. And once you see it, truly see it, you can't unsee it. By the time I heard his car pull into the driveway that evening, I was calm. Not numb, not broken, clear. Because the envelope hadn't taken something from me. It had given me permission. The days after the envelope passed without confrontation. That was the strangest part. He moved through the house like nothing had changed. Same late mornings, same casual tone, same assumption that the world was still arranged for his comfort. If anything, he seemed lighter. As if putting those words on paper had relieved him of something heavy. I noticed it in the small things. He stopped saying thanks. Not dramatically, just quietly. When I filled the gas tank in his car because he'd forgotten again, he didn't mention it. When I covered the internet bill because his paycheck was short this month, he didn't look embarrassed. He simply nodded, already scrolling on his phone, already somewhere else. Gratitude doesn't always disappear with a fight. Sometimes it fades because it's no longer useful. One afternoon, I overheard him on the phone in the driveway. He didn't know I was by the window. "Yeah," he said, laughing softly. "I'm sorting some things out. Trying to be independent, you know? Can't rely on people forever." People. That's what I was now. Not dad, not family. Just a resource with an expiration date. I stepped away from the window before he could turn around. My chest tightened, but I didn't feel surprised. The envelope had already taught me this lesson. This was just the confirmation. That night at dinner, he pushed his plate away halfway through the meal. "I'm thinking of making some changes," he said casually. "Might need you to sign off on a few things soon." I looked up. "Like what?" He waved a hand. "Nothing big, just paperwork. Since, technically." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Technically, I wasn't his father. So technically, everything I'd built was now negotiable. I watched him chew, noticed how comfortable he looked saying it. That's when I understood the real damage of denying someone's role in your life. It doesn't just erase the past. It gives you permission to exploit the present. You ever think about how much I put into this house? I asked. He shrugged. You lived here too. That was it. That was the line. Not cruel, not loud, just dismissive enough to sting. I nodded slowly and went back to eating. But inside, something hardened. Not anger, something more durable. That night, after he went to his room, I sat alone at the table and made a list. Not emotional, practical. What I paid for, what I co-signed, what was still in my name. I realized how easy it had been for him to rewrite the story because I'd never insisted on being seen as part of it. I'd let love stay invisible, assuming it spoke for itself. It doesn't. By the end of the week, I stopped offering. I still provided, but only what was necessary, never extra. No reminders, no rescues, no quiet fixes behind the scenes. He noticed. Everything okay? He asked one morning, eyeing the empty fridge. Yeah, I said, just adjusting. He frowned, confused by the shift but not curious enough to understand it. And that told me everything I needed to know. The absence of gratitude isn't loud. It's the space where respect used to live. And once I saw that space clearly, I knew this wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about boundaries. And boundaries, I was learning, are what remain when love is no longer enough. I didn't announce the change. I just stopped doing things quietly. No more calling the bank to smooth over late payments. No more explaining his absences to people who didn't ask. No more stepping in before consequences had a chance to arrive. For years, I'd thought I was protecting him. What I was really doing was insulating him. From discomfort, from accountability, from reality. And once the envelope landed on my table, something in me refused to keep playing that role. The first crack showed up on a Friday. He came into the kitchen around noon, fridge door open, staring like it had personally offended him. "Did you forget to grocery shop?" he asked. I looked up from my coffee. No. He waited, expecting the rest of the sentence. It didn't come. "So?" he said. "So you're an adult," I replied. "There's a store 5 minutes away." He laughed, but it didn't sound amused. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means I'm not doing it anymore." That got his attention. "Doing what?" "Covering," I said simply. "For you." He scoffed. "Covering what? You act like I asked for something crazy." I didn't argue. I didn't list everything I'd done. I just stood up, rinsed my mug, and walked out of the room. That silence landed harder than any lecture ever could. 2 days later, the mail came. A letter from the bank. Not dramatic, just firm, late notice. The kind I used to intercept before it ever reached his hands. This time, I left it on the counter. He found it an hour later. "Hey," he said, holding it up. "Did you see this?" "Yes." "And?" "And it's addressed to you." He stared at me like I'd spoken another language. "You're not going to handle it?" "No." That's when the edge crept into his voice. "Since when?" I met his eyes. "Since you decided I wasn't your father." The room went quiet. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I could see the gears turning, searching for an angle, a guilt lever, something that usually worked. Nothing did. That night I heard him pacing, making calls, voices low and irritated, doors closing harder than necessary. Reality was finally knocking, and it didn't sound friendly. I didn't feel satisfaction. What I felt was something closer to relief. Because for the first time in a long while, the weight I'd been carrying wasn't mine anymore. The next morning, he didn't say much, just grabbed his keys and left early. I sat at the table long after the door closed, listening to the house settle back into stillness. That's when it hit me. Love that demands self-erasure isn't love. And help that removes consequence isn't help. I had spent years confusing sacrifice with duty. But sacrifice only means something when it's acknowledged. Otherwise, it's just fuel someone else burns through without looking back. I wasn't punishing him. I was stepping aside. And sometimes, stepping aside is the most honest thing a man can do. Before the next chapter, let me ask you something. Quietly, honestly, just between us for a moment. Have you ever realized that the reason someone never learned responsibility was because you kept catching them before they fell? If that thought lands heavy, you're not alone. A week later, I found the envelope again. It was still in the same drawer, folded the same way. I hadn't touched it since. I didn't need to. Some words don't fade with time. They just sit there, waiting. That evening, he stood in the doorway of the kitchen longer than usual. "I'm going to stay with a friend for a while," he said. Not angry, not apologetic, just factual. I nodded. Probably for the best. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else, like he was searching for the right sentence and coming up empty. "Guess this is how it is now," he muttered. I looked at him then. Really looked. Not as my son, not as a stranger. Just as a man standing at the edge of something he didn't fully understand yet. "Yes," I said. "This is how it is." He left without another word. Later that night, I sat alone at the table, the house quiet in a way it had never been before. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel broken either. What I felt was space. Some debts are never repaid. Some truths arrive too late to fix anything. But at least now, they were spoken. And sometimes, that's the only kind of justice a man ever gets.